So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're logging in from the UK. My name is Benoît Dupont. I'm a professor at Université de Montréal, but also a member of OBIA, and I'll be moderating this panel this morning, a panel discussion on the legal issues on facial recognition from an international perspective. And I'm delighted to be the token man among four great women presenters. And I would like to highlight this remarkable fact that OBIA managed to bring together a diversity of perspectives and voices on a very important and timely issue. We will have four presenters and four presentations of about 10 to 12 minutes, followed by a Q&A period. And if you'd like to ask questions from the presenters, you should have a Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window. So please send us your questions and I'll moderate them and I'll ask them of the presenters. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the four presenters in the order in which they will appear. So the first presentation will be given to us by Céline Castet-Renard. She is co-responsible of the Axis on International Relations, Humanitarian Action and Human Rights at OBVIA. She's also a full law professor at the University of Ottawa and the chairholder of the Law, Accountable and Social Trust in AI in a Global Context chair. So welcome to you, Céline. The second presenter from New York is Rashida Richardson. She's a visiting scholar at Rutgers Law School and Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Law, where she specializes in race, emerging technologies, and the law. And she's also a senior fellow in the Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome, Rashida. And by the way, the complete bios of all the presenters are available online on the website. I think it's much more interesting to listen to them than for me to read about their extensive bios. The third presenter is Carly Kind. She's from the UK. She's the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, an independent research institute and a deliberative body that seeks to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. She's a human rights lawyer, and she has advised industry, government, and nonprofits on digital rights, privacy, and data protection, as well as in the corporate accountability in the technology sphere. So Carly, welcome to this panel. And finally, the fourth presenter is Caroline Lequen-Roth. She's an assistant professor of public law at the Université de Côte d'Azur in Nice. I'm going to say it in French. In 2018, she co-founded the program Deep Law for Technologies, which aims to bring together lawyers, data scientists, and computer scientists around the challenges of deep technologies. She was also the director of the Fablex DL4T Artificial Intelligence Law Clinic from 2018 to 2020. So welcome, Caroline. And thank you to Lise Langlois. I must say, I'm going to disappear at 11:15, so don't panic. Lise Langlois, the director of OBVIA, scientific director, will take over from me to take and to moderate the questions and the conversations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Céline to deliver the first presentation.
Thank you all. I'm very glad to participate in this panel with an amazing group of women. And I would like to thank OBVIA, Lise Langlois, Guillaume, and Laetitia for organizing this event. And firstly, I would like to say that I will present some of the main aspects of the report I wrote for OBVIA last September on the use of facial recognition by law enforcement agencies in the public space in Quebec and Canada. But while the report compares Canadian law with American and European law, I will let this part to the other panelists who will present their own countries. For my own presentation, I will focus on 3 main points. The lack of transparency in the use of this kind of technology in Canada by the police. I will consider the civil rights violation, the risk of civil rights violation, and also the federalism and fragmentation data protection laws in Canada. Let me see. Yes, the first point on the lack of transparency, but maybe I should explain very quickly what is facial recognition because I'm the first speaker. This concept is not defined in the laws, either in Quebec or Canada or other provinces. And we could say that facial recognition is a technology that combines biometric techniques, 3D mapping, and machine learning to compare and analyze a person's face in order to authenticate people or identify people. And I mean, when I say authenticate people, I would say that the goal is to verify that the person is indeed who he or she claims to be. Within the framework of an access control, for instance, and the identification, that is to say that the goal is to find a person within a group of individuals in a place, an image, or database from facial images. But the question we should ask here is to know what kind of use of facial recognition by law enforcement agencies in Canada we could see. We know that many countries use facial recognition in airports, at border crossings, and during events such as the Olympic Games, for instance. And we also know that in the US, police collect mugshots from arrestees and compare them against face recognition databases in photos taken from social media, CCTV, or traffic cameras. We know this kind of use in the US, but in Canada, we have very few information, and there is a lack of transparency, and we could ask what's going on in Canada, what's happening now. And through the case of Clearview AI, we have more information today because thanks to the New York Times and thanks to the revelation of this paper in January 2020, we know today that Clearview AI, which is a company which has developed a facial recognition application that compares any photo against a database of billions of freely available images from social networks and websites. We know this kind of system has been used in Canada by the federal police, that is to say the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and also by police services, for instance, in Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, and Halifax. So thanks to this investigation, we have more information, and we also know that this company has been investigated and is still investigated by the Office of Privacy Commissioner of Canada. It's a joint investigation with British Columbia, Quebec, and Alberta. And we have not yet the results of this investigation. But in response to this investigation, Clearview AI has informed Canadian privacy authorities that it will no longer offer its facial recognition services in Canada. But still, we have very few information about the use of AI and very few information, even if we know there are many social risks with this kind of technology. And we know there are especially civil rights violation or risk of violation. And we know that this risk have been documented and proven by many scholars. So I'm going to just to remind this risk for civil rights, the risk of violation of the right to privacy, violation of the mobility rights, freedom of expression, and of course the right to non-discrimination, because with facial recognition we have we have a lot of information about people. And we also know that the risk of surveillance can create a form of self-censorship of citizens, particularly in their participation in public life and in the exercise of their fundamental rights. So there are a lot of concern about this kind of technology. And I should add, of course, that even if this technology is highly developed today and deployed, there are still a lot of problems with accuracy, and the error rate remains high. And once again, a lot of studies show the problem of bias and gender, the bias with race and gender, especially the thesis of Joy Buron-Winnie, who shows that the facial recognition technology is more effective in detecting fair-skinned people and men than dark-skinned people and women. So it's a problem of bias, gender bias, and also racial biases. And other studies confirm this problem of bias regarding the minorities and regarding specific population, such as Asians, African Americans, and autochthonous. And one explanation is that these groups of population are underrepresented in the training images, and therefore not sufficiently representative of the population on which these systems will be used. But the problem here is specific. This problem is not specific in Canada, but currently in Canada, we try, there is a will to fight against systemic discrimination and racial profiling. There is also a will to reconciliate people and to create more opportunities for autochthonous. And of course, we can see the contradiction between the use of this kind of technologies and this political will. Given the potential for human rights violations, error rates, and biases in facial recognition algorithm, the lack of transparencies by Canadian policy regarding the use of these tools is of particular concern today. And I would like to add another part of the story, the question of the protection of personal data, the data protection and privacy laws in Canada. I don't want to be very precise, but just to mention the fact that these Canadian laws are a matter of federal and provincial jurisdiction, and there is a distinction between the public and private sectors. And that is very complex because only 3 provinces currently have their own private sector data protection legislation. That is to say British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec. But some other provinces such as Ontario have their own specific laws and have a sectorial approach in health, for instance. So it's a patchwork, and it's very complex to protect data, personal data in Canada. And currently, there is a wind of reform in Canada because yesterday a bill has been introduced before the House of Commons, the Bill C-11, which reform the federal private sector law, PIPEDA. And there is also another bill which has been introduced in Quebec last June, the Bill 64. So we can see that this matter is under reform, and reforms are underway. But even if we consider these reforms, the distinction between the private and public sector is still there and remains, and this distinction is less and less relevant as public actors use technologies developed by the private companies. So there is a risk here to create a gap in the data protection, and that is exactly the case with Clearview AI, and more broadly with the technologies today, with the AI technologies developed today. So we can say that currently there is not yet provincial or federal legislation in Canada to regulate AI and to regulate facial recognition. And in this context, many advocacy groups in Canada and elsewhere ask for a ban of facial recognition technology. And to conclude, I just want to add the fact that even if I focus on my presentation on law enforcement agencies, of course, the problem is not only with the police, and the use of this technology is not only a monopoly for the police. And we know, we have learned last month that also some private companies can use this technology without consent and without information of people, such as in this example, the Cadillac Fairview is a shopping mall operator. And this company used a digital information kiosk at 12 malls across Canada to collect and use facial recognition of images of 5 million people without any consent and information. And there is still a joint investigation in this case. And as you can understand here, finally, all remains to be done in Canada in regulating, banning intrusive surveillance technologies, as in many countries. And I stop here to give time to the other panelists, and thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Céline, pour ta présentation. What I take out of this presentation is the lack of transparency of institutions that should be delivering security to all populations, and also the fragmentation and the proliferation of initiatives from the public and the private sector, and finally the fragmentation of the legislative and regulatory framework. And I'm sure we're going to get back to it in the next presentation, but also in the Q&A session. So I'll now pass the baton to Rashida in the US, who's going to give us an overview of my understanding of the legislative and policy space in the United States.
Thank you, Bruno. And thank you all for having me here. So I am going to provide a general overview of the different types of use cases and policy approaches in the United States. And through that discussion, I'll talk about some of the legal issues, since many of them overlap with the concerns that Celine raised. Unfortunately, even though most of the global conversation around facial recognition and its legal concerns are focused more on law enforcement use, we here in the United States have used the technology in many different sectors. In addition to law enforcement, there's been a few controversial cases of facial recognition being used in schools, some for administrative tasks such as taking attendance, but in others it's taken as a security measure. And in fact, there was a large state backlash here in New York State, which led to the passage of a biometrics law that bans the use of facial recognition in schools as a result. There's also been instances of facial recognition being used on transportation services, both on highways, bridges, and tunnels, as well as public transit, such as trains and buses. There's also use cases in the housing sector where facial recognition systems are introduced at the entrances of buildings to be used instead of keys or even key fobs. And it is also used for migration and immigration purposes at ports of entry for our biometric exit program. There are a range of policy proposals that exist in the United States that reflect this type of pervasive use. And I'm going to give a general overview of each, starting with the most restrictive proposals and ending with some of the least restrictive. The first set of proposals are bans and moratoria, which I know is part of the global conversation around facial recognition because of the great concerns regarding the flaws that exist in the technology and some of the issues that Celine raised about the fact that there are great disparities in the accuracy rates across gender, racial, and even age lines. There's three main types of moratorium bans that have been proposed in the United States. The first is the most restrictive, and that's an unconditional ban, meaning that no government agency can use the technology. and laws with that type of unconditional ban passed in San Francisco, as well as Boston. Then there's sectoral bans, which, as I mentioned earlier with the educational example, seek to ban the use of the technologies in specific sectors. And here we've seen these proposals in education, housing, and law enforcement. And the last of this section of policy proposals are bans on specific uses, which are specifically bans or limitations on the integration of facial recognition into public technologies or other types of technologies used by different government agencies. Two examples of this is one, the Los Angeles Police Department issued a ban on the use of facial recognition on its drone usage. And in New York City, we have public Wi-Fi kiosks known as the Link NYC, which has a privacy policy which explicitly prohibits the use of facial recognition on these kiosks. The second category of policy approaches are the institution of standards, limitations, or requirements regarding the underlying databases that are used to run facial recognition analysis or data sources. One example, it came from the Center for Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, which is the recommendation as a best practice for police departments in particular to use better images when running facial recognition scans. And this policy was specifically prohibiting the use of artist sketches or even celebrity look-alike images, and pushed for the establishment of at least minimum photo quality standards, including pixel density and the fact that the full face must be visible in order for a facial recognition scan to be run. These types of proposals seek to improve the practices and policies for using the technology, not necessarily limit its use. There's also several proposals that seek to limit the running of facial recognition technology on specific government databases, including driver's license databases or immigration databases. And these are trying to also address some of the disproportionate impact that comes with the use of the flawed technology in certain sectors, as to not lead to greater right restrictions. The third category of policy proposals is one that mirrors some efforts from Europe and Canada, which is a data regulation. And in the United States, this is mostly a states-based proposal. Probably the most popular is the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which includes a consent requirement for any type of private vendor or entity to use biometric information for an individual. And there have been several successful lawsuits using these laws regarding violations of these policies. The fourth category is oversight and use requirements, and I think these can be broken down into two main categories. The first are policies that seek to create greater transparency regarding current and prospective government uses of facial recognition technology. And the second batch under there is policies that seek to impose requirements on government use of the technology. The transparency requirements in the United States have sort of started on the state and local level, in that they're part of a greater push for surveillance technology transparency that seeks to require government agencies to publicly report the types of technologies they're using, and this would extend to the use of facial recognition technologies. There's also been some proposals that limit who can use the technology. An example comes from Utah, where it only allows the State Department of Public Safety to use the facial recognition technology and to annually report the types of crimes that it was used to target. And other use categories include, or in other use requirements that fall into the second batch, are requirements around use, such as training for officers that plan to use the technology, or basic standards for human review if there is a match found by a system. And there are also oversight mechanisms to ensure that there's double-blind confirmation of any type of matches found by facial recognition system. And again, this is getting at some of the accuracy concerns with the technology in its current form. And then the final category of policy proposals, which is probably the least restrictive, but is more an investigatory approach, are the institution of government commissions, consultations, or studies. And these types of efforts seek to either prevent or limit the use of the technology while studying its current state of operation and trying to understand what is the best regulatory framework for mitigating the concerns from its use. And this is a model that's been adopted internationally, where Australia and the European Commission have also done similar efforts. But here in the United States, there's both federal, state, and local legislation that's seeking both to better understand how the technology works, what the proper restraints should be, and to what extent existing laws can help curtail the problems that we already see with the use of these technologies. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rashida. Very interesting, very fascinating typology of all the flurry of activity. We see there is a lot of proliferation of facial recognition initiatives, but also there is a pushback as well, and many different policy approaches that can be adopted. So I think we're going to have some very, very interesting exchanges around that. I'd like now to invite Carly to take the floor, please, or take the screen and share with us her assessment of what's happening in the UK, which is a country, of course, which has been using facial recognition technologies for a number of years.
Thank you so much, Benoit, and thank you so much for having me. So my name is Carly Kind, and I'm the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute. We are a research institute established in 2018 with the remit to ensure that data and AI work for people in society. And that means we're interested in the societal impacts of new technologies like facial recognition, as well as the ethical questions which arise with its use. We use research, but we also use public deliberation methodology such as citizens' juries and mini publics to engage with an informed public about some of these challenging ethical questions. So in the UK, as Benoit alluded to, facial recognition has been used for a number of years by a number of police forces. So in 2018, Big Brother Watch, which is a campaign group in the UK, reported that at least 3 UK police forces were using facial recognition. And since that time, the use has increased in both the public and private sectors, so police use, but also in the private sector as well. There has been a number of kind of high profile incidents and trials of facial recognition technology with police forces using them at football games, big carnivals, street carnivals, and on high streets and then other big public spaces. And there was quite a high profile incident in which a campaign group was filming a police trial, and the police fined a man who was walking past the trial camera and covered his face. They fined him with contravention of well, I mean, there's a question about contravention of what, but in the context of very little regulation around facial recognition technology, it was seen as quite an overreach. So there has been quite a lot of public attention to facial recognition in the UK in recent years. And that extended to the use of facial recognition by the private sector. So there was a number of kind of exposés about facial recognition being used in and around various development areas by private companies. And you can see there a tweet from the London's mayor about expressing concerns about that. There have also been a number of findings that the current legal framework for facial recognition technology in the UK is inadequate to really properly govern this technology. So the Biometrics Commissioner, who's an independent oversight function, has expressed his concern that the current legal framework is inadequate to really properly govern the use of this technology. The House of Commons Science and Technology Committee issued a report really calling for a review of the entire framework around the governance of biometrics and biometric data. And the Information Commissioner's Office has also suggested that a code of practice or some other regulatory instrument is necessary to make facial recognition lawful in the UK. And that those statements were confirmed with a decision of the Court of Appeal from the summer, which found that the use of facial recognition technology, in particular automated live facial recognition technology, unlawful for a number of reasons. fundamentally because there is not a legal framework which governs it in the UK, and that's obviously reflected in other jurisdictions as well. There's no mention of facial recognition technology in any law in the UK, and even existing data protection law is found to be not sufficiently clear and detailed to give people a kind of foreseeability that facial recognition technology will be used, and to govern the discretion with which police forces use it. The Court of Appeal also found that the data protection impact assessment that the police did hadn't really grasped the privacy issues at hand, and this stems from the notion that police have been arguing that there's nothing that differentiates facial recognition technology from CCTV cameras or other photographs or other types of image capturing of the public at large. And what the court found in Bridges was actually there's something fundamentally different about a system which scans many thousands of people with the purpose of identifying them, which is not the same as CCTV footage. And the court also found that police hadn't been able to exercise properly their duty under legislation to guard against discrimination in using the technology. And they had undertaken an assessment of discrimination, but what the court said was that they couldn't possibly be satisfied unless they had analysed the technology itself. And because the facial recognition system was an off-the-shelf black box system, the code for which could not be properly scrutinised because of questions around intellectual property, then the police force couldn't possibly satisfy themselves that there was no bias in the training data set, for example. So that's an interesting kind of wedge into this bigger question around the accountability of algorithms and AI in black box systems. So just three interesting conclusions I touched on there. So the idea that facial recognition is not analogous to photographs or CCTV footage. The court said that the automatic deletion of data of people not matched by the system would be necessary in any adequate legal framework. That is, if there is going to be a new law or piece of legislation governing facial recognition, it would have to require at a minimum that data is automatically and instantaneously deleted of those people who are not matched by the system against a watch list, for example. And the third one was this point about black box systems, which I already covered. So the Ada Lovelace Institute, in response to this attention to facial recognition in the UK, undertook last summer, in 2019, that is, the first national survey of public attitudes to facial recognition technology. We looked at the use of facial recognition in 6 use cases. And because we felt that we suspected, and I think this was borne out, that people's levels of comfort with facial recognition depend a lot on the context in which it's used, by which actor, and in which setting, and we wanted to try to really elicit some of that detail. We use facial recognition as an umbrella term, recognizing that, of course, it often refers to a range of different technical functions, from facial detection to facial classification, things like emotion detection, and then for recognition and identification against a watch list of suspects, for example. And we didn't really engage the public on what safeguards currently exist in law. We found that on the whole, awareness of facial recognition technology in the UK is high, but knowledge about it is low. So lots of people had heard or were aware that facial recognition technology exists, but a very small percentage of people said that they knew a lot about facial recognition technology. We found that people really identified with consent, and importantly, the idea of opting in or opting out of facial recognition to be a relevant and important factor for them. And this is important because, in fact, in law, there is no, certainly when police using facial recognition technology, there's no consent requirement under the existing law. The police are able to, an interpretation of existing law is that police are able to use facial recognition without consent or without providing the public with an opt-out function. So that was an interesting finding. We did find that there was support for facial recognition technology where there's a public benefit and some safeguards in place. We found that in particular, people supported the idea of police being able to use facial recognition technology in criminal investigations. We also found people recognizing that where there's a kind of convenience benefit for them, they might be comfortable with facial recognition technology in airports, for example, or on their smartphones. We found very little support for facial recognition in commercial environments, such as in supermarkets, in school, and in workplaces, and also in schools. We did find also, I don't have a slide to elucidate this, but we did find a difference in levels of comfort. When it came to police use, we found people were more comfortable with the idea of use of facial recognition technology in investigations, for example, to analyze existing CCTV footage versus live facial recognition technology deployed on public places, for example. We found that there was not unconditional support for police use of facial recognition technology. About a third of people we surveyed were uncomfortable with facial recognition technology being used by police, and they spoke to questions around the normalization of surveillance and the use of the technology ethically. We found most people feel that the government should limit the use of police use of facial recognition technology. And we found that low levels of public trust in private sector use of facial recognition technology. So majority of people were uncomfortable with the idea of facial recognition technology being used in shops or in for recruitment practices. And the primary reason given for that was that they didn't trust companies to use the tech ethically. We also found that people were in support of limitations imposed by government. We found that people should supported restrictions on the use of facial recognition technology in certain places, such as in schools. And in fact, more people agreed than disagreed that it should be outlawed in schools altogether. So building off the back of the survey, we've been doing three things, which I'll speak to very briefly. We've been advocating for a voluntary pause on future deployments of facial recognition technology in the UK. We have an independent legal review and the Citizens Biometrics Council underway, and I'll just talk to those very briefly. So we found that people broadly supported a pause on sales of facial recognition technology. So the idea of a moratorium writ large has got public support in the UK. And indeed, we've been arguing for such a moratorium. We can't say that we've had the same success that others in the US have had. And Rashida spoke about the proliferation of moratoria in the US. We haven't seen that, although we have seen, of course, corporate moratoriums imposed by some actors, which of course have a trickle-down effect to the use of the tech in the UK. Alongside that advocacy, we've commissioned an independent review led by Matthew Ryder QC, who's conducting a legal analysis of the existing regulatory framework and making recommendations for regulatory reform that we will then pick up and take forward. And finally, we've been conducting a long-form public deliberation initiative with 60 members of the public in 2 groups. They've been meeting across a number of rounds of workshops, at first in person, but we ultimately moved that online with the pandemic. And those members of the public have received evidence from a range of different experts, from police, from companies, from human rights activists, from academics and experts about the whole gambit of issues related to facial recognition technology. And they have come up with their own recommendations and their own thinking on where the UK should come down on this question of how it should be used and how it should be regulated. Some of the early recommendations that we're crunching through at the moment, we haven't yet reported these. There's interest from the public in an independent body, from potentially a body that's enabled to license the use of facial recognition technology. So some type of quality assurance process to, in particular, to go to questions of accuracy. We found general support for bringing human accountability into all uses of facial recognition technology. So one group recommended a biometrics officer. A number of people recommended an ethics committee, new legislation, and some suggested we needed a register of biometric technologies in deployment in the public service. So those are some of the initial findings from the council. Again, these are just lay members of the public who've engaged in this issue. I'll stop there, but happy to answer questions once we get into the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carly. We actually just received a question for you, but we'll ask all the questions towards the end so that we'll have a more integrated Q&A period. Thank you so much. And I must also mention that the link to the full report has been made available on the page of the panel. So if you'd like to read the full report, please go back to the page of the panel on the Obvia website, and you'll find the link to the report and to other publications from the panelists as well. And I'm now gonna finally invite Caroline to join the stage and to present the situation in France and the rest of Europe.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Obvia, and thank you especially to Celine for the invitation. It's very nice to share this afternoon with you. So I'm going to provide you a short overview of facial recognition in public space in Europe. What are the main challenges and perspective of the European legal framework? So as you can see, in order to do so, well, first I will present you the main European experiments that have been carried out in Europe and what concern they raise. Second, I will present you the European legal framework, and then we'll talk about what's next, especially for the European legislator. So as you can see in this map, every country in Europe have already experimented facial recognition, and especially in public spaces. And in three main fields: transport, public events, and more specifically, as we said, in sports events, and less successfully in school, especially in France and Sweden. So does the COVID and the health crisis stop this dynamic? Absolutely not, because we have to underline that the industry managed to quickly adapt itself in two ways. First, they provide some new uses of facial recognition. As you can see, in France, we especially used it during the crisis, during the lockdown, to monitor mask wearing, but in the city of Cannes and in the Parisian metro. And it also has been increasingly used to non-contact smart access control in the airport. The second way to adapt itself, industry has trained its algorithm with some new database fed with mask selfies that help to adapt to the older cases with people who wear masks. And as you can see, financial stakes are very high, so the industry won't let it go, and there is still an important lobbying in Europe in order to use and to develop facial recognition. So even the European Union during this crisis supports this dynamic, because as you can see, the European Commission has given what they call a seal of excellence that identify the technologies that can be used to monitor people during the crisis, and facial recognition is identified as one of them. So there are a lot of concerns in Europe. We already mentioned a lot, but I would like to talk about it a little bit more in order to point out the problem we have with our legislations. So the first one is the exercise of political rights. The United Nations report of July underline that the use of some such technology to surveil or crack down on protesters can lead to human rights violation, including infringement of the right to peacefully assembly. So the European authorities seem not really concerned by these threats because we often take the example of Hong Kong, and the answer here is we are democracy, we are not a dystopian state. So, but we have to keep in mind that there is an important slippery slope, as we can see, facial recognition is mostly used to secure events, and from securing an event to securing a protest and recalled demonstrators, the protesters, there's only a few easy steps. Second concern, we already say that, is privacy, because actually facial recognition is a very intrusive and invasive technology. It can help to trace people, to identify move patterns, and we also have to keep in mind that it has the potential to standardize people behaviors, and more specifically when emotion and gesture recognition is embedded. And a lot of recent experiments has been carried out in that way. So facial recognition technology tell us what is a normal behavior as a student during an exam, for instance, or in public transport. In France, we especially have an experiment on the tram. So we already talk a lot about discriminations, racial bias, and flaws in the system. I will only mention this very recent report from United Nations again that was published last week. It's about smart borders of Europe, and these smart borders include facial recognition in order to surveil refugees. And the study highlights how digital technologies are being deployed to advance the xenophobic and racially discriminatory ideologies that have become so prevalent. So this is also a major concern in Europe. At last, security. Can your identity, biometrics, and your privacy get hacked? Definitely yes. It's a very serious issue, as your whole life could be stolen if we stole your facial recognition records. And as a lot of studies showed, there are a lot of data breach in the device in this industry, so the risks are really significant. So what does the European legislation say about facial recognition? Actually, we don't have a specific law, but we have two main legislation that apply to facial recognition: the Law Enforcement Directive and the famous GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. So both establish the principle that of the ban. As you can read, processing of biometric data for the purpose of uniquely identifying a natural person shall be prohibited. Nevertheless, there are concerns about this legislation. First, because legislation do not really match the current uses of facial recognition, because when those legislations were adopted, facial recognition was not at stake. So it's not really appropriate and relevant to facial recognition. We'll see why. Second, there are exceptions, and very broad exceptions that leave the door open to abuses. And third, legislation are not protective enough regarding data collection. So first, the use of facial recognition, especially in public space, could be authorized by union or member state law on the basis of public interest or public necessity, which are really easy to justify for the public authorities. Therefore, I believe this legislation is absolutely not protective enough, especially for law enforcement, because there are some uses that could be very easily allowed. Especially in France, it's only a decree that can allow them. But there are also some unacceptable use in democracy, like we see for the refugees or for the minor orphans. So even if a legislator must provide safeguards, it's not sufficient to an effective protection of people. Second, you can allow facial recognition technology to be used on the basis of the consent. And we have to say that there's a murky line between private and public uses of facial recognition. For instance, in a stadium, which is a private in France area, you can welcome some public, and the police will use within the stadium, which is again a private area. So this use could be authorized on the basis of the consent, and as this very insightful article shows, there isn't any free and informed consent about facial recognition. Even Chinese people raise this concern. We have, at the moment, there is a trial in Hangzhou because they authorized the facial recognition for the entrance of a zoo, and the trials was about is there or not a free consent to it from the users. So the third concern is about data collect. As you can see in the text, the ban also concerned the processing of personal data. It does not concern the collect. Then, as a recent report of ANOW underlined, under the permission granted by RGDP and the directive, this implies that companies and governments can collect large databases of images which might later be used for law enforcement purpose. That means under the European legislation, the case of Clearview, the European legislation won't have prevent the Clearview case, because it is not forbidden to create such a database under the law. So what is at the moment the position of the European authorities? So last February, the European Commission published a white paper on artificial intelligence. And just before the publication, there were some rumors said that the European Commission was considering a temporary ban on facial recognition in public spaces. But at the end, the Commission only said that it would launch a broad European debate on the specific circumstances, if any, which might justify such use and on common safeguards. So the European Commission is actually in a wait-and-see position, and we can understand that given the global artificial intelligence industry dynamic, because Europe wants its industry, the industry, to be still in the race, which is at the moment led by United States and China. So European Union don't want to prevent its own industry to have the necessary field in order to experiment and get algorithm trained. So we had some hopes last summer, because the Black Lives Matters movement could have moved the lines, and especially the European Parliament and the Data Protection Authority took position in favor of a moratorium. But even if some watchdog also try to convince the Convention to ban automated recognition tech, it hasn't happened yet, and the Commission is still in this wait and see position. And as it has the initiative of the law here in Europe, it's problematic, you know. So what's next? Of course, we have to think about bans and moratorium. We really need a debate in Europe about those questions, all the more so as we don't have already any national legislation about facial recognition, while experiments are ongoing. But we also have to be very cautious, to my point of view, about those tools, because at the end, moratorium especially could legitimize and the use of facial recognition and institutionalize some big players, because we will stop to use it for a bunch of time, and at the end they said, okay, we have think enough, so now let's have facial recognition. And thinks the lobbying is very important. We have here an example of the law of Washington, which was supposed to be very progressive, but at the end we've been told that Microsoft employee literally wrote Washington facial recognition law. So maybe Rashida could help us on that case, but we have to keep that in mind at the European field too. Then when we'll have found what are the acceptable uses of facial recognition in Europe, we obviously have to think about procedural guarantees and technical safeguards. We already talk about procedural guarantees, but I would like to emphasize the importance of technical safeguards, because there's a global standards war ongoing, and China is really proactive, especially in the International Telecom Union. So European people usually say that it's not really matters, because we don't really use these standards of the ETU. But actually, we have to keep two facts in mind. First, Chinese companies sell smart city projects all over the world, especially thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative program in the South, but also in Europe. And second, our industry, the European industry, exports their surveillance technology in China, as the Amnesty International report shows, and they comply to the China's technology. And we have here, we made a report here in Nice about facial recognition in Europe, and we find that a lot of industry mentioned in this report are also have an activity here in Europe. So as Mark Warner, a US Senator of the US Senate Intelligence Committee, says, Communist Party leaders are developing a model of technology governance that would make Orwell a blush. So technical standards are also at stake in order to have a democratic framework. So as a very short conclusion, I would say that experiments raise concerns regarding fundamental rights and privacy. At the moment, we have an incomplete European legal framework, and we have from moratorium to safeguards to think about what could be and what has to be a democratic framework of the use of this technology. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Merci beaucoup for this very complete overview. And I think that's something you reminded us, that there are also some very powerful economic interests at stake, and innovation policies push in one direction, and regulations and the protection of human rights in another direction. And this is the background and the subtext of what we are discussing as well. So it's thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. We have a lot of very interesting questions from the audience. So I'm gonna take them in the order that they arrived. And the first one is maybe more for Céline, but I think Rashida can also chime in because it applies to the policy landscape that she described in the US. Is a fragmented policy landscape in Canada, but in other places, can be an opportunity for different jurisdictions to try distinct approaches and learn from one another, especially with regard to this new technology? And if yes, does it also create kind of constraints under the form of uncertainty for citizens and additional costs for the deployment of AI facial recognitions solutions? Sorry. So maybe Céline first.
Okay, thank you for the question from Spectator Anonyme. Yes, it's a good question, because we could think, thanks to federalism and thanks to the different approach and the respect of different cultures and territorial approach, we could have the best regulation for each part of the country, and maybe we could have the choice and we could improve the system. But very often we could see the contrary and an effect which is not very positive, which is the fragmentation and the patchwork I mentioned. And it's difficult, for instance, for the private company to respect and to fulfill all the requirements of all this regulation. And the risk here is the lack of compliance. If it's too complex, we could have an effect. We could have some barrier to enter in a market, for instance, and we could also have a difference between the smallest actor and the other. So I'm not sure that the diversity is good in theory, but in practice it's very difficult to respect to know and to respect all this regulation. So I should say diversity could be complexity, and I think that's the case. And regarding surveillance technology, I think it's also an opportunity for actors to avoid regulation.
Thank you, Céline. Rashida, do you want to maybe provide a US perspective on that? Because it's a large country with lots of different jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I'd say the patchwork effect is actually somewhat intentional in that I didn't give this in my background, but I did previously work, and this is how I know Céline, and I worked on a lot of surveillance and privacy laws in the US. And part of the problem is that at the federal national level, there's most of the laws that we have in place were passed in the 70s and 80s, and they're fairly outdated. And the federal government is also sort of swayed or impeded by a heavy lobbying effort from the tech sector, which means nothing actually gets passed. And as a result, there was a necessary means to create more activity on the state and local level to force the conversation on the federal level. And that if you do have a patchwork of regulations, it's actually against the interest of large companies that seek to have their facial recognition or other technologies deployed nationally, because you can't really design or develop a tool that can then fit many different regulations and also have wide market expansion. So part of this is quite intentional to create many different types of more stringent regulations that we don't think necessarily would be possible on the federal level if the conversation originated there, to then force the conversation on the federal level of what should be done, what is a more comprehensive approach to addressing these issues. And in some ways, it's speaks to what Celine just said of you may identify the best practices, and that what may happen in Washington will be completely different from what we're able to get past in New York. But seeing how these different regulations play out in real time will also allow us to see whether there are blind spots we missed or holes that need to be fixed, and it allows for then another locality or another jurisdiction to improve upon what's already there.
Thank you, Rashida. Next question is for Carly, but I think, Caroline, you can also answer it because I believe it applies also to the COVID-19 situation. So Carly, do you have you analyzed the responses based on the proximity of events of land attacks, but I assume this is a reference to terrorist attacks, or questions that impact society in terms of security? And I think that COVID-19 is a good example as well. Do you think the answers may vary in terms of proximity to the occurrence of this type of event? So would the kind of general context of sense of crisis and emergency might actually change the perception of people with regard to these security technologies and surveillance technologies?
It's a great question. There's another question as well about this, about the benefits of the technology and how we weigh them against the potential harms. I mean, one thing is to say that I personally think that the benefits have yet to be demonstrated. I think there's a lot of overstating the potential use of facial recognition technology for finding missing children, for example, in a way that makes missing children take an outsized kind of role in, or seem an outsized problem compared to the technology itself. And I think one missing piece in the conversation seems to be how can we actually be specific about what the benefits are of facial recognition technology to police forces and articulate that in a strong case that really takes account of the kind of cost benefit analysis as well, like how much money is being spent on these systems, how much money is being saved through using them, what is the potential increase in crime solved, or whatever other metrics we might be able to develop in order to really understand the benefits, rather than just kind of allowing generalized claims about their benefits to stand, which they tend to do. But to your point, to your question, Benoit, I think I'm in two minds about the impacts of the present crisis on the facial recognition debate. On the one hand, at least in the UK, the public conversation on facial recognition has receded into the background, in part because we don't go anywhere. And so there is no role for facial recognition technology, in particular in public places, if there's no people in public places. And so it's really gone completely from the public radar. There's no news stories. There's very little conversation about it. And I do wonder whether the long-term impact of that will be people don't care. People aren't so worried about it anymore because they have many other things to worry about. Previously unimagined crises are now on their doorsteps. And people are becoming more accustomed to it and used to public health surveillance methods in response to the crisis, including contact tracing, both digital and manual. And so there could be a shift in the normalization of surveillance amongst our societies, and thus greater acceptance of facial recognition technology on the one hand. But on the other hand, it could be that because the momentum around arguing for how necessary facial recognition technology is to our societies has been lost because of the pandemic, that perhaps police forces move away from it, or people think that it's not as important to argue for anymore. And I think that's complexified by the fact that with the wearing of masks is actually rendering redundant some of these old systems. So I think the pandemic this year has been a really interesting interruption of the conversation around facial recognition technology, and it will be really fascinating to see next year where it goes from there. I think there are multiple paths the conversation could take.
Caroline, do you want to add something, because you're based in Nice, which has been hit by
Yes.
the terrorist attack and has deployed smart cities solutions that include facial recognition as well?
Yeah, so it's difficult to talk about French people broadly, but what I can say is that French people are a bit reluctant to that kind of technology, as the disaster of our tracing app during the COVID show, because it didn't work at all, because people didn't want to have that kind of tools. There's also the facial recognition experiments with in the Parisian metro during the crisis and in Cannes were not really welcome neither. So this confirmed the reluctance. But we have to say that our political our policies see an opportunity with terrorism, especially because just after the terrorist attack, the mayor of Nice announced that that would not have happened with facial recognition, which is absolutely false. But still, he used it in order to deploy this kind of surveillance in the city. So it's the same for the Olympic game. At the moment, they withdraw the law because they were afraid that the Conseil constitutionnel will sanction it. But still, there is a strong will, a strong political will to help this industry and to deploy that kind of device in our city. So yes, terrorism helps to, especially terrorism, not COVID, but especially terrorism is an argument to develop it.
Thank you, Caroline. We have a kind of contrarian question from Hassan Yayawi about private companies developing facial recognition. And would you like to provide advice on how they could be doing that while ensuring the security of the data? I don't know who wants to take a first stab at the question.
I can try, but I'm not going to answer it directly. So I'm sorry. Because part of the problem too, and I think this was brought up in some of our presentations, is that there's not consensus even in society about facial recognition. So I don't think it's simply concerns about the security of the data that creates the lack of customer trust. It's the fact that it's being deployed in many sectors and situations that people in society have no interest in seeing it being used. And I know that, and I loved Carly's slide because it shows that there's some divergent views depending on use and depending on sector. And I think that's part of the problem, is that when facial recognition is used in certain circumstances, it can amplify abuse and many of the legal concerns we raise. So it's not simply how secure you can have the data or what are the best security mechanisms that one can have in place. And I think the other problem too is that we've all touched upon the fact that the technology does not work that well and doesn't work that well for everyone. So again, I don't think that's necessarily a data or security issue, but that's a development issue. And that's because many of the data sets that are used to design these systems are not representative of society. And that's why we see that the technology does not work across race, gender, and age groups. And so I think if I'm to be more idealistic and say and think that we'll get to a point in society where there is greater consensus or at least interest in using the technology, then I think companies actually need to be responsive to those exact concerns that are being raised by policymakers and community members, which really are dealing with accuracy, discrimination, and abuse concerns, and see maybe whether, like, I know some companies like Amazon said they were no longer going to sell to law enforcement for the next year, which was responding to community concerns in some ways about the abuses and legal concerns that arise in the law enforcement context. So I think it's more that companies can think about who they're selling to and also the validity of their product. And that may change the relationship with customers, but I don't think it's necessarily going to fix the problem, because I think there still are large contingents of society that have no interest in facial recognition technology being used at all, or specifically not in certain sectors. And that's not necessarily something that companies can create fixes around.
Thank you, Rashida. Maybe there are many questions. Maybe I'll move on to the next one, and which is about the same kind. Why is not the same kind of scrutiny applied to other types of surveillance technologies, such as the use of cellular phone data that enables the same kind of tracking, very intrusive surveillance as well? Why is that? Why is such an interest for facial recognition to the maybe kind of not replicated in other types of surveillance technologies?
I'll give a couple of responses to that. I think, I mean, certainly I think there's something very visceral about the idea of your face being used as an identifier and as the means by which you can be tracked. And I think that that's something that really resounds with people that we've worked with on the Citizens Biometrics Council. And there's a few reasons for that. One is because it's immutable. Your face, you can't change it. Or you can't easily change it, and that means that you're limited in how you can conceal yourself, how you can claim your anonymity in certain ways, and another is because you can't leave it at home the same way you can leave your cell phone at home, and so again you're forced to identify yourself inadvertently wherever you go. And I think that those are kind of very integral parts of facial recognition technology, which give it a different quality to other surveillance technologies, and which people find very kind of fundamental to their responses to it.
Can I just add one part from the US? And that I also think it depends on what countries we're talking about, and that issues around data location tracking have been both targeted by public policy approaches and litigation for the past couple of years. And there was even a Supreme Court case here, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So I don't think it's necessarily that facial recognition is or that there's more public scrutiny towards it. I think there's more public awareness about the technology, where there may not be as much public awareness about sort of the breadth of location data tracking. And if there isn't a lot of active litigation or policy work happening around those issues, then it's less likely the public will be outraged in the same way as they are about facial recognition, which gets a lot more media coverage.
Thank you.
And maybe I would like to answer to the question of Eve. Eve Gaumont asked if we need a regulation, and if we have to focus on facial recognition or biometric or something broader or something else. I don't know exactly, but I think that just a first thought, I think regarding facial recognition, there is specific issues, especially when you consider the biases and the problem of accuracy. And if you consider the fact that when you see a face of someone, you have many information about this person. And I think that's different of a fingerprint or other biometrics data. So I think, of course, there are some common issues, but maybe some specific issues, and probably we should address specifically this issue. These issues, even if I agree with the idea, it's not necessary to have a lot of different rules and for each technology, but maybe if we have specific social issues, we have no choice, and we have to duplicate our specific regulation.
Okay, thank you. The next question.
I guess I can jump in since I brought up the bans. So first, I want to complicate part of this question in that some of the applications of facial recognition to identify terrorists is not good, and it's actually highly problematic. So I wouldn't necessarily list that as a benefit, even though it's often touted by government as one. But also, if you're to look at the spectrum of potential benefits or good use cases versus all of the harmful cases that we've already found, it leans very heavily towards harm. And I think that's why the ban conversation is on the table. Or even moratoria, which is a temporary ban. And most of these bans or moratoria include some type of study of the technology. And that's because there's an understanding that there can be some value or utility of the technology, but right now in its current state, the harms and risks that are presented with the current state of the technology greatly outweigh the potential benefits. And I keep emphasizing potential because we don't have that many examples of it actually working very well, even though it has, I have seen even cases here in the United States of it being used to find missing people, but there's also other methods and technologies for doing those same very tasks and that don't come with the same attendant risk and harms as facial recognition technology. So I think with the conversation of bans and moratoria, it is still very necessary because we're talking about a technology that doesn't work 100% and doesn't work 100% for the diversity of society we have today. And I don't think it's fair to say to 70% or even 60% of the globe that we're willing to accept the risk and harms that you may face from the use of this technology for potential benefits that may only be extended to some people, because you have to think about the fact if the technology is being used to find people with dementia or missing people, if it doesn't work for someone that looks like me, it's not going to find me. So that benefit doesn't extend to everyone. And we need to find regulatory approaches that allow us to make sure that all interests are sort of seen equally.
Thank you. Carly, would you like to add something about the benefits?
I spoke to that before, actually, so I don't have anything more to add.
Okay, so we continue.
I would like to add something, Lise, if you mind. Yes, even if I agree with Rashida, I think we should not focus our argumentation on the flaws and the fact that it doesn't work, because when you talk with industry, they answer you, well, but it's getting better and better, and one day we are going to have a super result and blah blah blah. So we also have the right, we also have to wonder if we want to be recognized in the society all of the time. It's a very broad and philosophic and existential question we have here. And Celine was talking about the necessity of having a specific law. I think this specific law should address the problem of being recognized, but not also with our face, with our behavior, with our voices, sorry. So I think that's the main concern, and the fact that there are bias that can be correct, or there are flaws that maybe someday will be fixed, should not be an incentive to the industry to allow them to develop that kind of thing in some uses.
Thank you, Caroline.
May I add something
Celine,
else?
yes.
The question of terrorism and security issues, it's always the same question. It's a balance between security and privacy, and it's always there is no way to resolve this problem. But I think there is something very important here, because it's different to consider a targeted surveillance and a general surveillance, and there is a problem and some principle of necessity and proportionality. And I think we have to keep in mind this principle, because these principles are main principles before the European Court of Justice, before Supreme Court everywhere in the world, or almost everywhere. And I think that's some principle just to this principle could help us to find a balance between the aspect which could be useful in the technology, especially for law enforcement agencies, and the privacy, the liberty of the freedoms of people.
Thank you, Celine. The next question from Ella Jakubowska. It's about the topic of bias. Do you think that we should be pushing for less bias and more accuracy in the technology, or would this simply lead the even more accurate, scary, discriminatory use of the tools? Who wants to answer first? Carly, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Ella that the conversation around bias frames the problem in a way that doesn't capture all of the concerns with facial recognition technology. So in particular, a narrow focus on bias skews answers around the representativeness of data sets and improving the accuracy for everybody. But it doesn't answer any of the more fundamental ethical questions, such as that which Caroline just identified, which is around persistent identification, the impact on radical movements, on progressive thought, on privacy, on anonymity, and all of these social values as well. And it also doesn't answer broader questions around bias and discrimination. It only answers narrow questions. It doesn't answer the question of whether or not these technologies, even when 100% accurate, are used to reinforce racist policing policies or are used to surveil already over-policed communities. And so it can be a real distraction, I think, from the broader societal questions. Nevertheless, I think it shouldn't be circumvented. At the very least, we should expect technologies that claim to do one thing to do that thing. And so we should critique it from the perspective of accuracy first and foremost, but we shouldn't let a conversation around accuracy move the frame such that we just end up with really excellent facial recognition technology that it works on everyone all the time, because that doesn't work for our societies necessarily either.
Thank you. What, Rashida, maybe, would you like to add something?
No.
No, Caroline, Celine, it's okay? Okay. I will take the last question because it will close in 3 minutes. It's from Z Zong. Do the information collected in public place belongs to public domain, meaning no privacy concerns? This is no limited to facial recognition, for example, private residence in Google Map. Caroline, maybe?
Actually, it's not the same kind of data, because we are talking about biometric data, while in Google Maps we are talking about not personal data. So it's not the same legislation, and obviously not biometric data is your own. It doesn't belong to the authority, of course.
Thank you. Okay. I think we will finish this panel. I would like to thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Celine, to have produced this report for OVIA and organized this very rich international panel. I would like to thank all of you for this sharing of expertise on facial recognition. It is a matter, I think, of law, of course, but also ethics. We discuss about for the benefits of who, in which context, why, and also trust. It's a matter also of democracy, because it raised the question how we should govern ourselves and the question about accountability. The example of citizen council, like suggests Carly, it's very, very interesting. And I think we should look more deeper about this organization. We can see also that this international point of view is necessary. And I hope we will continue to collaborate and discuss of this important topic in the public sphere, because I think the public should know what's going on, and we need to continue to have this conversation. So thank you, Celine, thank you, Caroline, Carly, and Rashida, and thank you all of you to attending this international panel. Thank you, Guillaume, the scientific coordinator of OVIA, and Laetitia Dupuy, who organized the publicity of the event. And hope you have a safe and well health during this strange period. So thank you, everybody, and take care.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone.